So I am delighted to welcome to the Crediton Literary Festival 2021, brackets online, close brackets, for the final panel of the day, the wonderful Stephanie Scott. Stephanie, where are you joining us from exactly today?
Hi, Mark. I'm joining you from London. Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun to be here and talking to me about my novel, What's Left of Me Is Yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed. We are looking very much forward to hearing all about this. For those that don't know everything already about Stephanie, Stephanie is a Singaporean, Indian and British writer and one of the Observer's 10 best debut novelists of 2020, a fact that I extolled about earlier on today. She also won a BAGS Toshiba studentship for her anthropological work on this novel, What's Left of Me and Yours, and in fact has been made a member of the British-Japanese Law Association as a result of that research. What's Left of Me and Yours is a New York Times editor's pick, a Daily Mail and a Woman and Home Book of the Year. I have also mentioned that earlier today, but also was recently longlisted for the Jarlath Prize Book of the Year and the Crime Writers Association John Creasy New Blood Dagger Award, and if that was not enough, was shortlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. That is quite a string of accolades, or potential accolades, is it not? Congratulations to you for all of that, Stephanie. And this is, as I've said, your debut novel, so tell everybody a little bit about it, what it's about, and what inspired you to put this story together.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, this is the book. This is What's Left of Me Is Yours, and it's out in paperback. This is the hardback cover, and it is set in Japan, with an entirely Japanese cast and inspired by a true crime that occurred in 2010. So Japan, like many jurisdictions around the world, has an at-fault divorce system. And there, if you want to divorce your spouse, you can hire someone to seduce them and provide you with grounds for divorce, or at least an upper hand in the proceedings. And what happened in the original case was that a marriage breakup agent was hired by a husband to seduce his wife and provide grounds for divorce. Only the agent fell in love with his target, and the wife fell in love with him in turn, and she was later murdered. And I mean, I have deviated from the crime and created sort of new backgrounds and characters and changed the dynamics, but the initial premise of this triangle remains. And in real life, the agent, he was swiftly arrested and confessed to the murder. And he said that you know, when he was talking to police detectives, that he loved her, and he loved her still. And when I read that for the first time in a newspaper article, I wondered if that could possibly be true, if you could love someone and kill them. Because love in its ideal form is selfless. So the immediate answer to that would be no. But then I started to think of Tolstoy and the idea that there are perhaps as many different kinds of love as there are people. And so how we love and how our sanity and our existence can hinge on that of another person, and what we are capable of doing to each other for love is really how the novel began. I've just seen a comment which says, no spoilers, please. Don't worry, I'm not spoiling anything. The novel is a whodunit and a whydunit, but all of the information I'm telling you, this initial premise, you actually get on the first page, so it's not a spoiler at all. It's really just how all of these people came together, and the novel is effectively a murder love story.
Yes, don't worry. We will talk about the background a little bit to this novel as we go along, but no spoilers will be issued forth, Alison, or anybody else who's concerned about it. So don't worry, you will not get any clues from Stephanie as we go along, I'm sure. If you want to ask any questions to Stephanie as we go through this panel, do just type them into the chat window and I'll pick them up and intersperse them with my own as we go along. So don't be shy in coming forward and asking Stephanie questions if you want to do so. Now this is, as you say, set in Japan, but you yourself grew up, I believe, in Singapore.
Yes.
And you're half British and half Indian. None of those things are related to Japan necessarily. So what actually drew you to Japan?
Well, actually, Singapore is a former colony of Japan. It was occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War. And both sides of my family, the Indian and the British, fought the Japanese in the Second World War in Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. And actually both sides of my family have been in Malaysia and Singapore for several generations. So it's very much our home. And actually my Indian grandparents, to whom I was very close, they became fluent in Japanese during the occupation, and they were in Malaysia at the time and moved to Singapore later. But you couldn't work in the region, you couldn't really function or do anything in the region unless you spoke Japanese. So my Indian grandmother actually met a Japanese soldier and taught him English, and they had a very unusual friendship, really. You know, he even wrote to her when he was repatriated to Tokyo at the end of the war. My Indian grandfather wrote a book on how to speak Japanese, and my British family had very different relationship, I think, with the Japanese, having fought at Kohima, and some of them died on the death railway in Thailand. So there was one side of the family that was extremely close to Japan and remained close to Japan, and another side that, you know, had a very difficult and conflicted relationship. So growing up in Singapore with these two sides of my family, you know, I think I was very aware of Japan and its culture and its people and its language, basically from birth. So, and this is something that has always interested me and fascinated me. And so when I read the article, I already felt quite close to Japan. But, you know, as you quite rightly point out, I think it's one thing to have an interest in a culture and a country, and quite another to, you know, write a novel and have an entirely Japanese cast and set a whole book there, and embed it within that history and culture, which is what I decided to do. And is perhaps why the novel took 10 years, in that I did a lot of anthropological work and sort of specialized on the position of women, which is something that fascinates me. And there's a lot of Japanese law in the book, and I wanted to make sure that if I was going to set it there, that all of the systems, all of the procedures were correct, and that the novel was authentic. So a huge amount of work went into that. Perhaps even a small degree of madness. Certainly my husband would say so.
It's interesting hearing you say a lot of those things. My wife and I have been watching a series on Amazon Prime called Asia from Above over the last few days, which looks at a lot of the areas that you just been talking about, Thailand and Burma as was, and so on, and those influences of other countries, the French influence in that area through the war and so on, for example. So I can picture a lot of the kinds of things you're describing in that historical past there. That's really interesting. Yes, you say you took 10 years to research and write this novel, which is a very long time for a fiction book, not so much perhaps if it was a non-fiction title, which you would expect a lot of research in that way for. And as I said in the introduction, you were even made a member of the British-Japanese Law Association on the way through because of that research. Can you expand on that a little bit more and tell us how that came about and how what you found out during your research then went into the novel itself?
Sure. So the first thing I did with this book was to go to Tokyo and meet with Richard Lloyd Parry, the Asia editor of the Times, who'd covered the real case. And he was very generous and shared his articles with me. But then the next thing I did actually was to approach and work with a lot of lawyers, defense attorneys, and prosecutors in Tokyo, but also at the Japanese embassy in London. They've been immensely supportive of my work, and their lead secretaries for legal affairs helped me for several years actually, and they ended up recommending me to the British Japanese Law Association, and that it was rather wonderful. It is still rather wonderful to attend those events, because I do like to keep my hand in and keep aware of and abreast of issues and things, and it's always wonderful to expand one's network, particularly in another field. And I think I am the only novelist I've met there, certainly. It's quite funny to introduce oneself as a novelist there, but I worked quite extensively with these professionals for several years just to understand the law itself. And I mean, the novel takes place from, there's a past timeline, which is the love story between Rina and Kaitaro, the Wakare Sasea agent, and that takes place in the 80s and 90s. And then there's a present day story where Sumiko, a young woman, a newly qualified lawyer, has grown up never knowing how her mother dies, and she effectively goes in search of the truth of what happened to her mother. And so, it takes place across several decades, and Sumiko's raised by her grandfather, who's also a lawyer, and so there's basically the law features in various forms across those decades. And I mean, the law is very much a living, breathing, man-made thing. So I was very interested in how it evolved and how this would impact on my characters, because it really did. It really does have, as it does on all of our lives. I mean, some people are lucky never to have to deal with the law, but for most of us, you come up against it sooner or later. And what happens to Yoshi, who's the grandfather and the father of Rina, the woman who's murdered. He is a lawyer, and when Rina dies, he would be known as a forgotten party in Japan. So victims of families of victims would effectively have been kept out of the legal process. So, they would be interviewed by detectives and investigators, but then after that, they were largely expected to get on with their lives and forget the people who had done them harm, and they wouldn't have been included in court proceedings or even told of the outcome of sentences or anything like that. And the only reason Yoshi is able to get the information he is because he's a lawyer and has the inside track. And, these families of victims are still known as forgotten parties today, although life has changed for them very much. And Sumiko, as a newly trained lawyer, she comes across this professionally, but then also in discovering how her mother died and discovering the fact that she is in fact a forgotten party. It becomes very personal and intimate. So there was that juxtaposition constantly between her personal and professional life that I wanted to explore. And also, sadly for Sumiko, what I found out when I was talking and working with lawyers in Tokyo was that even though things have changed for forgotten parties now, the law has evolved. You can have someone to represent you in court if you wish. You can cross-examine the perpetrator who's harmed your family if you want to. But none of this would be possible for Sumiko because the crime that occurred to her occurred so long ago. So I was told categorically that the public prosecutor's office would never, under any circumstances, give Sumiko the case information or the trial information or access to anything she needed. And so I had to find ways around that, which naturally influenced the plot, the characterization. I had to create new relationships. And also, and also I think fall back on that lovely stalwart for novelists, which is human behavior, because, even if things aren't strictly appropriate or correct, people will do what they want to do based on their emotional pressure points. And so everything that happens in the novel could happen. It's perfectly possible. And lawyers, I ran every scenario by the lawyers I worked with, and they were like, this is possible. yes, it can happen. Frowned upon, but it can happen. One even described Simiko's solution as very naughty, but at least it's possible. So these are the sort of rabbit warrens you go down.
Yes, I think as long as it is actually possible, whether it's likely is another matter entirely, isn't it? If it's not impossible, then it's fair ground to put in there. Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly believable. I mean,
yeah.
I think people can do all sorts of things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's just a note from Annette in the chat there. She said she'd love to read your grandfather's book, being married and lived in Japan and being part Indian and part Jamaican herself, and with her kids being half Japanese, that would certainly be of tremendous interest. Tremendous interest to her.
Thank you. Wow, what a fascinating background. That's
yes,
amazing.
I'm sure a lot of this will resonate, certainly for Annette, particularly from what you're saying. Did you have any particular influences in mind, as either literary influences or more kind of stylistic ones when you were putting this book together?
Oh, definitely. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's a murder love story, and I read across genre, and I write across genre too. It's really at the heart of the novel. So, it contains a murder love story, but it's also a story of mothers and daughters. And, I think the two main characters in the novel are Rina and Sumiko. And it's their stories, the women's stories, that really drive the book and that fascinated me. So, again, in looking at these two women across their generations and their time frames. Rina is a photographer, and she effectively gives up her life to become a salaryman's wife. And we see the effect that has on her. And also, I think that the tension that is always a gift to a writer between societal expectations and personal desire, and how she deals with those things, and then how in turn her daughter deals with those things. And what was very important to me, which was when I first read this article, in the Times, was the idea that people read these articles, there's coverage of murders, of femicide, of domestic violence, in increasing rates around the world all the time. And people can become very inured to these stories, particularly if you see them in the press. It's always something that happens to someone else somewhere else. And it was very important to me, I think, to focus on that and to treat Rina as a victim, with the respect she deserves, really. And, because I think murder victims are sometimes the most brutal of ways. And often as well, these women can become defined by the moments of their deaths. That's, they're murder victims, and that's all they become. And I really wanted Rina to have a full life and a history and a legacy. And so it was very much about reclaiming her story and writing her history. And that's what Sumiko, her daughter, does. She encounters the same article. And that's all people would know about her and her mother. And so in going on this journey, she's reclaiming their lives and also writing her own identity. So in that way, the book works across genres and forms and does many different things.
That's a really important. That's a really important point as well. I was just going to say, thinking back to the historical fiction panel that we had this morning, which was called Forgotten Voices, and was about giving voice to people across very many different periods of history. This is exactly that same process, isn't it? Is giving a voice to a victim in a different way, perhaps in this case, but still nonetheless equally as important. So I'm glad you raised that. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
There's just Alison is just asking for a little bit of clarification on your 10-year time span of this. Was this 10 years part-time, as in did you write it alongside a proper job, a day job, another job? How many hours would you say that you wrote or researched per day?
That's a really good question. And, to an extent, the answer is yes. My degrees are in literature. but I used to work in investment banking, which largely funded this book, and I write full time now, but you know, of course I wasn't writing and researching all the time, and there are definitely parts when you're writing a novel where you do need to put it in a drawer and separate yourself from the manuscript. I think that's really important. And even when you're doing very intense research, there's a time when you need to put it down, and then focus on the prose itself. So, and I never really stopped researching in that time. You know, I was still checking, still discovering, still doing things right up until my copy edits. I think in the middle of my copy edits, I wanted to describe a certain prison, and there were no photographs that were available of it. And I ended up finding a painting done by a former inmate, at which point my editor quite rightly took the manuscript away from me. I think this was of her. But also, you know, life intervenes. In that time, my husband and I had very heavy caring responsibilities. My mum became seriously ill on top of that, you know, so I had to take 2 years away from writing the book, and I could only dip in and out of reading and keeping my knowledge level up. So all of these things come into the mix. But I read the article in 2010 and started the writing process, and it was published in 2020. So that's the timeline.
Excellent, thank you for that. I'd like to think a little bit about the Japanese culture and society itself. Just to lead into that, Annette's asked a kind of two-part question. Just to take the first part of that for a minute, do you speak Japanese yourself?
Well, now I speak it very badly now. Unfortunately, languages fall out of your head. It was certainly better when I was in Japan. And my godchildren are Japanese, so I think they're the only ones who tolerate it now. But I'm very interested, so I'm not fluent at all by any means, but I'm very interested in etymology and you know, the evolution of language. And Japanese is such a beautiful language, and I think it has such extraordinary concision as well, and multiplicity within words that are very beautiful. And I, you know, love the significance of the characters. The written characters, these are very important to the names that I chose, the histories behind them, the numbers of strokes. It's all in there. It's all key for me. So the Japanese language is very much a character in this book. And I, towards the end, I worked with 3 translators to ensure that it was correct. So I wasn't simply relying on my own language abilities. But yes, it's very important. And also my characters are photographers, and so I did a lot of reading from about Japanese photographers, and they have wonderful essays that are extremely personal to them, where they talk about their lives and their photography and their work, and the language used is, you know, beautiful and very, very affecting, and symbolic. And so all of that has gone into the novel as well.
I'm just having in the back of my mind as well that I interviewed Natasha Pulley, the author of The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, a little while ago, and her position was quite similar to yours in many respects. She had a scholarship and studied and lived in Japan, and the culture is very much part of that as well with her books. There's a lot of similarities there. Some of these roles that you talk about and ideas that you talk about are very distinct probably to Japanese society. The Japanese culture is quite a distinct one, unique in many ways. Thinking about this job of Kai's, of a professional role to essentially break up marriages. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Japanese for that role. That's obviously got a lot of scope for you as a novelist to play with, but it's not a concept or an idea that perhaps we'd be familiar with from other Western cultures. So how exactly does this work within Japanese society, this idea of being able to professionally employ somebody to break up a marriage? Yeah.
Well, actually, it's really interesting that you say that, and a lot of people do assume with this book that this practice is unique Japanese, but it isn't. And for me, I first encountered the marriage breakup industry, as it were, in the novels of Evelyn Waugh. And the hotel divorces of the 1930s, you know, where you could hire an actress to enter a hotel with you, have a photograph taken, and provide grounds that way. And I think here, you know, in those situations, the husband and wife are deciding, of course, who is going to bear the blame. But that was where I first came across it. And even the French produced romantic comedies about it. And even the Italians have films on divorce that revolve around breakup artists. And then there's, you know, I suppose honey trapping, which, you know, could be said to occur around the world in various forms. So it's actually much more of an international practice that occurs across, you know, several cultures, and that really interested me too. But in Japan, it does have a very specific role as well because of the at-fault divorce system. And I mean, in Japan, as you probably know, being quite the aficionado yourself, there is a marriage setup industry that is very traditional and respected and integrated within society. And, you know, I think I even have friends whose parents used to work at large corporations in Tokyo, and those corporations would have marriage setup divisions for putting together relationships. So there is that on the other side of the coin. But the marriage breakup industry is much more covert. It's normally attached to private detective agencies, and it can involve a huge range of work, actually, from, you know, standard private detective work, following stakeouts, you know, discovering whether a spouse is having an affair or not, to full-on breakup jobs. And I mean, it can be used in a variety of different ways. You know, I think employment law is very difficult. It can be very difficult to fire someone in Japan. So if you want, you can hire someone to shame them into stepping down. And you can also use these agents to separate a daughter from an unfavorable boyfriend, or wives can use them to split their husbands up from their mistresses. And so there are any number of options. And most recently, I was speaking to a worker agent in Tokyo. Most recently, they've started a kind of setup service where if you want to know what happened to your high school sweetheart and you've lost touch, they can find them and find out, you know, what's going on in their lives, and maybe construct a meeting. So the possibilities are endless, really. I think as with human nature, the possibilities are endless.
I can certainly see where the link would be there between them and the private detective agency. There's a lot of similarities, isn't there? You mentioned before about photography and about that being important in this particular story as well, especially from the kind of the love story aspect of this novel. How is photography important, and why did you choose to use photography in that way?
I think I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was reading a lot about these photographers, and I was just really struck by the sort of the interchange of the personal and the professional within their artistic practice, but also as a medium, it's perfect, I think, for depicting characterization, personal choices, and also for constructing a love story. I effectively became a photographer for this novel, and I worked a lot with photographers as well. And it's wonderful to hear them talk about their experiences of the darkroom and developing extremely tactile and intimate, and you know, they would go into raptures about the smells of the chemicals and you know, the weights of different things and the timings that you use, and it just became very clear to me how very intimate and personal it is. And so, you know, if you want to establish intimacy very, very quickly, it's great to do so across an artistic practice, particularly a practice which, you know, is not necessarily lucrative or or supported by families. For example, so Rena is encouraged to be a lawyer. You know, she's never encouraged to be a photographer. And in fact, when she does embark on photography, she's pushed into marriage over it, you know, so she has to constantly fight to pursue this thing that she loves. And it's very much the same for Kaitaro, her lover. You know, he's a private detective agent really by necessity. He needs to live, but he wants to be a photographer. And so when they're engaging and he's looking at her photographs, he can tell the way she's chosen to develop some of the shots, you know, when she's dodging and burning, which is literally putting your hands between the light source and the paper and affecting the shading and the light and the dark in the photograph itself. Again, this is extremely tactile and personal, but he can trace these decisions when he looks at her work, and it forms an immediate, very powerful intimacy, and also how their work both evolves when they're together. You know, it's this is really central to the love story, in that they build each other up, they reaffirm each other, they grow together, and there's this sort of artistic and romantic dependency that develops. So it just, the more I looked into photography, the more it just seemed to be the perfect medium for this book.
I want to ask you about your choice of genre for this book. We spoke earlier today about romance novels in Jenny Kane's talk. So maybe you're dealing with a love story here, but hang on a minute, because somebody dies, so there's a murder. So should you have been in the crime panel this morning with this? Is this a crime novel? But then you've got these stories about mothers and daughters that kind of span different generations. So maybe you've written a family saga, and we should have categorized you in that genre instead. Or where should we categorize you? Why have you gone with this mixed genre approach? And do we actually pin this down anywhere at all as a particular genre book?
That's a great question. I think really, if anything, the category of literary fiction is probably why my publishers were just, literary. It's a wonderful broad category in that it encapsulates all of these different kinds of forms. But I think I was determined to write the novel this way, not only because that's how I read, but because that's how I think people are. We resist, it's all very well for publishers and booksellers to want to put fiction in boxes, but fiction is a reflection of life, and the people in it are not easily boxed. They resist categorization. I certainly have always resisted categorization throughout my life, and so it's really no surprise that the book would do so as well. I've just seen a question which is a really good one, which is, did that make the book difficult to place? Yes, absolutely it did. Not in America, where it sold very quickly in a preempt. And I mean, it sold quickly in the US, in the UK as well, but we did keep coming up across this, my agents and I, is it crime? Is it women's fiction? Is it, where do we put it? And I suppose it's literary commercial, and there's something in it for everyone. And I really hope the industry will open up and accept more books like this, because certainly I, as a reader, don't want to read one thing. And I love romantic novels. I love love stories. This is dark. I think one of my friends coined possibly a new term for it. He called it romantic noir. So there's another category for you. But I just think that, literature is definitely the love of my life, and there are so many different aspects to it, and I would hate to reduce it in any way.
You run the risk, don't you, of doing that by sometimes over categorizing things, and you can lose that kind of broader aspect of it. I can see that. Thanks, Alison, in the chat for that extra question about pitching it to agents as well. Let me think for a minute about the title as well, if I may. If it's What's Left of Me Is Yours, which could be read probably a number of different ways. Is it intentionally ambiguous? What are you signifying a particular thing, or do you want it to be ambiguous? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, actually, I think What's Left of Me Is Yours, it applies to every single character in the story. Perhaps most obviously with Sumiko, who's in search of her mother, and that what's left of Rina is all she has left. But also it refers, I think, to the baggage that we can carry through life, the damage that life can inflict on us, particularly in new relationships. Rina and Kaitaro, they've had many relationships before. This is their final one, and it's really, I suppose, when you go into a new relationship, you bring everything that you are with you. So What's Left of Me Is Yours, it applies in that way, and also to Rina's father, Yoshi. There's an aspect as well, I think, to this, where when I was growing up, I read An Inspector Calls, and I think that idea of group culpability has always fascinated me. So even though the novel is a whodunit and a whydunit, and there are definite culprits, to an extent, everyone in the book is implicated in what happens to Rina by the choices and decisions they make, even Rina herself. So it very much comes back to that idea. Having said that, What's Left of Me Is Yours was not the original title. And it was my American publisher, the marketing department, who right at the end of edits, I cannot emphasize this enough, right at the end of edits, not at the beginning of acquisition, but during the edits, said that they hated the title, and we were categorical about it. And they hadn't read the book either. The person who really hated it hadn't read the book yet, and I was like, but this title is, it's been written in, it belongs to the novel, but they were like, no, it has to be changed. So I actually had to come up with a new title. They hated, the title they hated was The Sentence. So in the prologue, Sumiko describes herself as the line at the end of an article, the final sentence. It's also about sentences in language, identity, how we describe ourselves. It layered through. Anyway, they hated it. So 2 weeks, I had 2 weeks to come up with a new title, and also write it into the book, because I was really, they sort of said, oh, don't worry, it doesn't need to be in the manuscript. And I was like, no, my titles pervade the fiction. So I had to embed it, and I had to break the ending of a scene, which was very nice. And just as I wanted it to be, I had to break it to physically insert the title. But I think, we've come to peace with it now. But thank you for liking The Sentence. I appreciate that enormously. I like it too.
There have been books, haven't there, that have gone with a different title in the US and UK markets as well. But I guess that wasn't an option this time.
Nightmarish. I have several friends to whom that has happened, and it drives everyone crazy. You want one title, and that was the challenge that was presented to me. Actually, my agent was very clear. He was like, we just want one title in across jurisdictions, so go. So we had to get something that everybody liked fast. I think that was quite frenzied. Part of the editing process.
I've certainly spoken to novelists who have put more grief into choosing the title than they have choosing the words on the page for the entire manuscript. Did it go the same way with you?
Yes, it was really stressful. And as I say, at the end of editing, editing is such an interesting process. And I normally love editing, but when you're editing with your editor, you're editing to time, and there are all sorts of somewhat arbitrary in-house deadlines that come up that mean you just need to work a lot faster, and certainly all the time. And I'm expecting a baby now, and I just cannot imagine working that way with a child. But so many amazing authors do. She'll just have to look up to them and beg for their advice, I think. But it was the cherry on top of the stress. Absolutely, come up with a new title that everyone wants, thread it through the manuscript, you know, so that it was like there had never been anything else. That was, yeah, I think creativity under time pressure is very stressful.
I can imagine. I can imagine. Do you think that this novel has a particular message, a particular something that you want people to take from it after reading it, or is it very much open to interpretation what people take away from this story?
It is very much open to interpretation. I think, you know, at the end, I have, but I've ultimately tried to end on hope. You know, the novel is an exploration of love and, by extension, humanity. And it's a tribute, really, to the many common problems and complexities that occur across all of our relationships. It's universal in this sense. So I would like it to encourage people to look more closely at the world around them and to treasure the people in their lives. I think that's ultimately what I would like the takeaways to be.
Excellent. And I hope people do take that away from it. There's a couple of other questions I just want to turn to in the chat. The second part of the next question from earlier on, Annette was asking whether you came across any particular obstacles in your research, bearing in mind you are researching in another country, about another culture, even though you have some knowledge and experience of that, obviously, from your own family life. Were there particular obstacles to what you were trying to do?
No, nothing that I couldn't get around. So, you know, I think, and particularly with, say, conversations about the law, you know, when they were conducted in Japanese, I would have had, well, I did work with various translators. You know, I think there's nothing that you can't find a solution for. I was very lucky in Japanese law, there are a number of really noted American scholars who have, you know, published several works on the legal system in Japan. And so I could refer to them as well, which was interesting. But basically, other than finding out facts like, you know, the history and evolution of forgotten parties, or, you know, the fact that a certain character wouldn't be able to access information in a certain way, and then I'd have to reroute the plot and various things. Apart from just, you know, any of the normal issues you would encounter in information gathering, no, there's nothing really that you can't do. And I also found when I was traveling in Japan that there are so many lovely local groups who want to, you know, who will act as guides and show you around their areas, and they're very proud of their homes and their heritage. And, you know, there are all sorts of wonderful things that I think you can encounter that can help you with novel writing, rather than obstacles themselves. I think, you know, one just has to, you'll always find a solution one way or another if you're persistent enough, I think.
Alison's asking how much of your original books, your original in inverted commas book, made it into the published version. Did you have to make a lot of edits for the agent and the editor?
Oh, it's a good question. I would say, sorry, this is my cat, Toby. I don't know if you can hear him.
It's okay, Zoom cats are welcome, it's fine.
I would say 90% of the original book made it through. I mean, as you have probably gathered, I write quite slowly. I'm very into poetry and I like concision, so there is a messy first draft, but it's also, I've thought through it so much. I think there were only 3 drafts of the novel largely that I did. And I had agent interest very early on, which was lovely to have. It was very reassuring. but I decided that I would only send the manuscript out to agents when it was truly ready and when I'd worked on it a lot. So what they received was quite a polished version of the book. And it was still terrifying to send out. I mean, still, I've never been so frightened. I think I wasn't even that frightened when my agent sent it out to editors. Although still pretty frightened. There's just lots of rounds of terror. Well, you know, lots of terror. But I think what was also what you might find interesting is that I did get offers from several agents, but they all wanted to do something slightly different with the novel. So going back to our discussions about genre, you know, they wanted to sort of turn it in different ways. And that was really great when it came to editors, because I think I knew what I wanted from the book. The agent that I went with, Anthony Harwood, who was amazing, really shared my vision for the book and understood it from the get-go. He was, which was wonderful to have, because you really need your agent to share your vision and fight your corner. And so that was a huge source of reassurance. But then when we sent it out to editors, you know, it was a similar thing until we found, we were very, very fortunate to find editors in America and UK that saw the book the way we did and just got it. You know, that was really affirming and lovely. So, you know that you can, know that you know your work best and that you can have a vision for it and you can follow that vision, and listen to everyone who comments by all means. But ultimately, you know, I think my English editor said when she sent me the edits, her editorial notes, she said, take what chimes with you and discard the rest. And that was really lovely. Like, it stuck with me. It meant a huge amount to me. The respect and the freedom that I was given, I will always be really, really grateful.
It's a piece of advice as well there that we heard earlier on in the suspense panel when this question of sending out manuscripts came up, and the advice was to not send manuscripts to agents until you've spent a long time polishing them and making sure that they're the best that they can possibly be, because ultimately you only get one shot at most agents and you don't want to waste it. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. It was something that was said to me. I did the Faber novel course, which I very much recommend, and it was something that was said to me at Faber. They said, we don't actually care how long a novel takes. Take as long as you want. You know, we care that it's in the best condition, and you do only have one chance, which is why I perhaps waited quite so. But I actually don't regret any of the time that I spent. It went out at the right time, and I knew I had edits. You know, I had further edits. I think my agent would have sent it out immediately. I wanted to do some more stuff, and in the end, he had to pry it from my hands. And it was the same with my editors too. They, as I said, with the ongoing research, my lead editor was like, "Give me the book." Yeah.
It's another story that we've heard. Another story that we've heard more than once today from authors is agents and editors having to, you know, kind of physically hold them down and prize manuscripts out of their hands as they're grasping onto them to make that final edit. Yeah, it paints a lovely picture.
It's
yeah, it really is. Louise is just saying in the chat, there's been a lot of really good advice about publishing from all the authors today. Penny Batchelor in the last panel was also a Faber course doer too. Yeah, and she was very complimentary about that course too. Yeah,
it's very good. It deals with the tool, I think, of writing, the tools you need and just the practicalities. It's great.
Before I move on to the last couple of bits to wrap this up, is there anybody who would like to ask anything else further of Stephanie about this book? Please do drop anything in the chat if you want to know anything else. Yes, next book. That's what I'm just about to come to in a minute. Any other questions other than next book?
Shall
Okay,
I answer? um, well, so I mentioned earlier that my family, my British and Indian family, were in Asia during the Second World War. I would love to focus on my Indian grandparents, particularly my Indian grandmother, because she had to flee her home when the Japanese invaded Malaysia and hide in the rubber plantations. And her greatest grievance about this time, whenever she talked to me about it, was that she had to leave not only her home, but her school and her final exams. And this is what really bothered her, not being on the run from an army, a terrifying army, but missing out on her exams. And so she hid with her family in the rubber plantations in the jungles of Malaya for a substantial amount of time. And then she met this Japanese soldier and taught him English and eventually emerged from the war, by which point she'd married my grandfather and started to have children. And so, I think for a while there, she thought that any sort of professional life, she had great academic aspirations, she had great professional dreams, and there was a point, I think there must, in her life where she thought none of that would happen. But what she did was to emerge from the war. My grandfather was a bit of a scapegoat. He was always having affairs and never really providing for the family. And so what grandma did was to take her exams and send herself to university and study law. And she became the first female partner of the largest international law firm in Singapore. And she worked with Japanese clients for the rest of her life. And she was absolutely pioneering and is still known today. And we lost her sadly recently, but I was extremely close to her. And I love this trajectory of her story from being a frightened, angry girl in the jungle to the formidable woman she became. So I would love to focus the second novel on her in some way. And she had 3 daughters and my mother and my aunts, and she's left us a wonderful legacy. She also wanted to be a novelist, actually, and she didn't live to see this publication. She died just before it. But yeah, I would love to focus on her.
It certainly sounds like a story that is really deserving of telling, absolutely. And I hope you do that. Alison very rightly says in the chat there that you're carrying her legacy, and what a fantastic way to do it. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I am aware of the fact that in a couple of weeks' time, there will be a new, smaller version of you too.
Another girl. Well, another girl. She's so willful, by the way. She's already so willful. Yeah.
Congratulations to her for still being inside at the end of your talk. That's good. I know that there are a couple of weeks to go, but sometimes these things happen early, sometimes they happen late.
Yes.
It could have gone either way.
She's willful, so she really is willful. She will do whatever she wants, I'm sure.
Are you going to have to take a break from writing? I'm obviously going to have to take a short break from writing, but I mean, are you intending to try and do as much as you can during those first few months, or are you going to step back a little bit?
I am, I think, just because, I think as an author, you really are, it's very entrepreneurial. You are, it's your life, really. So, and my book is actually coming out in paperback in the US just before my due date, which is marvelous. So I will be trying to keep my hand in, but I'm also going to try and take some time, maybe a month or out and just be with the baby and focus on the baby. And my husband's also going to, because I'm still working, he gets shared paternity leave, so that will be quite nice. So we're going to try and juggle it optimistically.
You can but try. You can but try. We wish you the very best of luck with all of that. Stephanie's book is available in hardback and in paperback in the UK. in hardback and very soon in paperback in the
Oh,
US.
no, it's out. Yeah, yeah.
Audiobook as well?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's a British audio version and an American as well. Yeah.
Excellent. There is no reason not to get hold of a copy in whichever is your format of choice. You can also borrow it from your local library. You can certainly borrow it from us because it's on our display at the moment. Oh, in Japanese, ? Asks Annette. Is there a Japanese translation?
Not yet. One of my beta is actually a Japanese editor, and she absolutely loves it. But the pandemic has done so much to so many, so it's just slowed that down. But the novel is currently on sale in Tokyo, but it's the English edition that's available there. But we can hope slowly.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Stephanie, for taking the time to come and join us. That is the end of our final panel of the day.